Thank you so much for joining us today for this Donorbox webinar. My name is Jenna, and I am the nonprofit advocate here at Donorbox, and will be the moderator for this awesome webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with Donorbox, we provide nonprofits with simple and effective tools to manage their online fundraising activities and connect with individual donors on a deeper level. To date, we have helped 50,000 organizations across the globe raise over $900 million. To learn more, you can visit us on our site at donorbox.org. And today, I'm so excited to be joined by Tamela Spicer to talk about storytelling to build your nonprofit's charisma and impact. So I've got a quick bio for Tamela. Tamela has worked in the philanthropic sector for over 30 years. We're in good hands today, you guys. Her roles have included founding a boutique consulting practice, working as a regional development director for the Salvation Army, regional director for the Arthritis Foundation, and the executive director for the Flat River Outreach Ministries. Most recently, she has served as a program manager for the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University in West Michigan, where she serves as an adjunct faculty teaching strategic management and fundraising. That is quite the resume. Now, Tamela specializes in board development, change management, fund development, strategic thinking, and is particularly skilled in working with faith-based organizations. And I'm sure we have a lot of faith-based organizations logging on today, so that's great. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Education and Theology, as well as a master's degree in Communications. Wow. All right. Now, before I pass the baton over to Tamela, I want to mention just a couple of items. Please note that this presentation will be about 40 to 45 minutes with additional time allotted at the end for Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the link to our Donorbox Knowledge community to access that after the webinar. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat section throughout the webinar, and I will be diligently working behind the scenes to mark those questions so we can get to as many as possible. We're also going to be launching some polls today. Tamela provided some awesome polls, so please be sure to participate. All right, everyone, without further ado, please give Tamela a warm welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. So excited to be here today and really appreciate the opportunity to partner with Donorbox on this presentation today. So you've already heard about me, so we won't go there. It's really always hard for me to sit and listen to someone do my introduction. But I do want to check in and get a sense of where people are from, kind of what your role is. So if we can launch that poll, I just want to get a sense of, are you showing up as a volunteer with an organization, an executive director, kind of how you view storytelling. So you should be able to see that poll launching on the right-hand side of your screen. Just want to know if you're a volunteer, program officer, interested bystander, sort of where you are. All right, so it looks like we have a pretty good mix of program staff and executive directors. I love the fact that we have several board members on the call. I appreciate that board members take time to engage and learn, because it's so important to be engaged in your organizations. So great to see that we have a pretty good mix today. Executive directors and program staff seem to make up the majority of our folks. We have a few interested bystanders and a couple of volunteers, so wonderful to see that. So, all right. So appreciate that, guys. Appreciate you putting that information in the poll. It's helpful just to know kind of who's here as we go through. I'll try to keep that in mind to contextualize the information that we're going to go through today. Okay, so let's get started. Why do stories matter? Think about your own experience with stories. We've all read great books that we feel really engrossed in. My daughter laughs at me because I have a tendency to cry at movies and books, and I'm a crier. So it comes easily to me. And I've been so engrossed in stories sometimes that I almost feel sad when it ends. You get to the end of the book, or nowadays we binge watch everything online, and you get to the end of a series and it's like, I sort of like these characters. I like these people. and it feels bad when they have to go away. So stories matter. We all engage in stories every day, whether we think about it or not. So as you go through this today, just think about your own story, your own experience with stories. Like, how do you think about storytelling? What does it look like to you? How do you actually think about the impact that stories have? So there's actually interesting brain science around the fact that our brain responds to stories. If we're reading something that's really engaging, in our brain, we can't distinguish between the experience itself and the story that we're reading. So we feel like we've been there. We feel like we've had that experience. Again, think about stories that you've read, really great books, or maybe movies that you go back to time and again because you just felt so engaged and immersed in those things. So stories matter because our brain responds. Stories also provide connection. It's a way to bring community together. Think about your donors. How do we develop that sense of belonging in your donor community? Stories help us do that. Stories also can inspire us to action. If you think about a great story that you've seen or a great story that you've read, have there been stories that have encouraged you to take some action? Stories are a great way to sort of merge meaning and emotion. It's how do we connect both that analytical side of our brain and the emotional side of our brain? How do we connect these two pieces? Stories give us a great opportunity to do that. And in fundraising, this is key because when we're talking to donors and we're telling our story to donors, we don't always know, is a particular donor moved by the emotional aspect of the story, or is a particular donor moved by the data and the how much impact, how many families we're housing, how many people we're feeding. Everybody has a slightly different trigger that's going to move them to action. And stories allow us to mesh all of these things together in one great package. So it really is an opportunity to put, I always like to say, put a face on the numbers, right? If we have a lot of great data to talk about the work of our organization, how do we put a face on that so it becomes meaningful to the individual? Stories help us do that. Stories also provide a great opportunity for clarity. We can actually gain a lot of clarity about a particular topic through a story. Nonprofit organizations that maybe have a really robust programming, and I've talked with clients before and they say, but we do 47 different things and we don't know how to tell that story. Well, what's the common thread that ties together all of those 47 different things that you do? Why do you do those 47 different things? And if we can provide that clarity for people by telling a story, that's what's going to help them connect to our organization. So stories matter. We can't discount the power of a story in our fundraising efforts, in our efforts to cultivate volunteers, in our efforts to build partnerships. Like, it matters across the board for us. So how do we learn to be good storytelling organizations? How do we learn to be good storytelling individuals? What we want to do is be thoughtful about how we create a storytelling environment within our organization. This is where the power comes from. If everybody learns to tell great stories, then we have not just one person, our fund development staff, going out and telling a story, or our executive director going out and telling a story. But if everybody learns how to be a great storyteller, then we have multiplied our capacity to reach the community. So this is what we want to practice in our organizations. We want to think about how do we develop this across the board so that our organization becomes a storytelling organization. So as we think about how best do we do that, there's a couple of things that I want you to consider. And some of these tips come from a book called Do Story, and it's a very short book. I highly recommend it. You can find it on Amazon. And the author's name is Babette Buster. She talks about, she's not necessarily writing to nonprofits. She's talking about how to be a great storyteller. She references how we do this in nonprofits throughout the book. But she offers some really interesting tips to how to be a great storyteller. And she says, think about sitting across the table, having a cup of coffee, and telling a friend. When we tell stories for fundraising purposes, we want to be thoughtful about creating that sense of connection, engagement, belonging. What better way to do that than to act like we're talking to a friend? which means we don't use very formal language necessarily. I mean, when you talk to a friend, you use contractions. You don't use very formal language. You usually speak in short sentences. So how do we talk to a friend? So as you're telling stories or writing stories for your organization, think about doing this to a friend. I read a book several years ago about a woman who had walked the Camino de Santiago, and she wrote a book about her experience. And I couldn't help but feel the entire time that I was reading this book that I literally was sitting across the table having a cup of tea. Just the language that she used and the way she described it, and it felt warm and belonging. I wanted to know more about the story. The other thing we want to do is we want to set a GPS for people. I don't know about you, but I've watched movies or television shows or read books sometimes, and I'm like, I don't have a sense of timing. I don't know where this is happening, and it feels disjointed. If we really want someone to engage in the story, we have to set a little bit of GPS for them. So where does the story take place? What's happening? What's the timing? What time of year is it? How much time passed if we're telling a story that happens over time? So that people have that groundedness and they sort of understand where they're at. Another key is to make sure that we're using active verbs. What's the language that we use in our story? This is incredibly important, especially when we're reading a story. Passive language can feel flat. We might not quite understand why it doesn't feel right, but it's usually because we're writing in passive language. So in English, and I can only speak to how this works in English, but in English, when we're writing in the passive language, we tend to use verbs that end in ing a lot. So if you're writing in English and you're working on Microsoft Word, you can actually go up to the Find feature in your document, and you can type in ing, and it'll pull up in your document every single word that ends in ing. I can't speak to some of the other languages that we have represented. It's been many years since I've been engaged in grammar in Spanish, so I know we have a few folks from Latin America joining us. But when you think about passive versus active, an example, he was walking to the store. It's okay, it tells a message, but it just feels a little bit flat. If we say he walked to the store, it feels a little more active. So when we think about what's the language that we're using, we want to make sure we're using active language. When we tell a story, we want to be vulnerable. Being vulnerable invites people into relationship. And you might think, well, that's kind of weird to think about for an organization. How is an organization vulnerable? Well, we always want to put our best foot forward, and there's something to be said for that as we're building our organization's brand, as we're building our reputation in the community. But we don't want to put this face out there that we're so perfect, because then we don't feel authentic. So if we can build in a little bit of that vulnerability as an organization, what are some of the warts in our organization? What are some of the challenges that we have? It's okay to tell that story. In fact, it usually invites deeper relationship if we're vulnerable. The other thing is when I, as an individual, am out telling my story, so we have some board members on the call and we have some volunteers on the call. My hope is that you're engaged in telling stories for your organization. And what you want to do is make sure you're bringing yourself to the story. Even as staff, yes, we're paid and we go into work every day and we're there for a reason. But my hope is most of us who work in the nonprofit sector do this because our heart's connected to the work. So how do you bring yourself into that story when you're telling the story? You can do that both in written form. You can do that whether you're using videos, whether you're using sitting down face-to-face and telling the story. How do we bring ourselves to the story? That means in a nonprofit organization, as your volunteers are engaging, as your board members are engaging, they need to have some experience of your mission so that when they're out telling the story, they can bring themselves to the story. We want to make it personal. And the key to great storytelling is we always want to leave people wanting more. We want them to come back to us with, I want to know more. I want to build a deeper relationship. I want to get more invested. That's going to be the key, especially as we're doing fund development work. So that means we don't have to tell everything in the story. We want to leave them with some questions so that they'll come back and continue to engage. So when we think about great storytelling, What we want to do is be mindful and intentional and strategic to say, as I'm telling the story, what do I want the individual to think? What do I want them to feel? And how do I want them to act? So every time we tell a story from a nonprofit organization, we want to be mindful of what are the things in the community that everybody assumes about us that maybe aren't true. So what are those myth busters, either about our work or the population that we serve? For example, when we think about a nonprofit organization that is working with people who live below the poverty line, there's a lot of public perception about that population. A lot of it that's not even true. When I used to run a nonprofit organization that had a food pantry, I remember asking my board one time, what do you think about when you hear the term poor or poverty? And the things they came up with were lazy people, people who aren't educated. You know, they had a whole list of really negative images. And I said, but that's not who we serve at all, right? We serve people who have run into an emergency in their life that put them behind financially. We serve very well educated people who can't work in a traditional job because of an injury or a mental health issue. So there were all of these myths that people had about our population that we served. So as we think about writing our stories or telling our stories or demonstrating our stories in social media, what are those myths that we want to bust? And what do we want people to think about why we matter in the community? Why is our organization important? The next thing is to think about, what do I want them to feel? We have to be really careful when it comes to fundraising and emotions. There was a great book written a few years ago called Emotion Raising that looked at all of the science and research and data around how certain emotions move us to action. And what emotions do we want to be thoughtful about within fundraising? When we think about emotions, we don't want to paralyze people. So we don't want them to be too angry because that can often paralyze people. We don't want them to be too sad because that can also paralyze people. We want some balance of emotion that's going to move them to some action, but it has to be balanced. It has to be an emotion of caring. It has to be empathy. It has to be this connection to our work. So be thoughtful about what kind of emotion are you evoking. Anger is not a bad emotion to evoke if it's balanced, right? The sense of righteous anger. I'm angry about a systemic issue in my community, but I need to feel like I can do something about it. If I don't feel like I can do something about it, I'm not going to be moved to action. And the final thing when we're telling stories is, what's the action I want? So somewhere in that story, you have to be able to invite them into deeper relationship. And that invitation might be a gift, a financial gift, fundraising. It might be come and volunteer with us and deepen the relationship. It might be just attend our event so that you can learn more about who we are. But there should be some call to action in each of our storytelling communications. And you want to be thoughtful that you don't have 10 different calls to action because it's very confusing for people. So be focused. What's this one action you want me to take? So I want to pop up another poll just to get a sense of your own experience and your organization's experience with storytelling and how it builds charisma. So we've got another poll that we can pop up here for you to see. Yeah, Emotion Raising is one of the books I'll put that in the chat box before we're done. So we got another poll.
Make sure I'm pulling up the right poll for you. Hi, everyone. Sorry for crashing. We have a lot of great poll questions today. Tamela, which one would you like me to launch?
So there are a couple of questions around charisma. So
yes.
Pop those up.
Okay, so we'll start with this one here. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So when we think about charisma, can organizations be charismatic? Yes or no? I'd be curious about that. And we have a couple other questions that will pop up once we kind of see. I really appreciate you guys participating in the poll. You're all typing away over there. So looks like most of you believe that organizations can be charismatic. A few of you aren't sure. That's awesome. Nice thing about these polls is there is no wrong or right answer. So appreciate you popping in there. Okay. All right, let's go on to the next poll question around charisma. So most of you believe that an organization can be charismatic, and I would agree with that. They can be. So when you think about charisma, oh, here we go. Do you think your organization is charismatic? Ooh, we're pretty even on this one. And part of this too is how do you think of charisma? Like, what does it mean to you? So when we think about whether or not our organizations are charismatic, we're pretty even on that. Many of you think it yes, and many of you think no, but we're pretty split on that one. So when you think about this idea of charisma, what does it actually mean? Is it influence? We think about charismatic as often connected to religious organizations. Is it the energy level? Is it trust? What does this idea of charisma mean to you? Great. A lot of you are thinking it's about influence, someone with energy, that sense of trust. Awesome. Great. And it's a little bit of all of these things when we begin to think about charisma. How can storytelling help us build charisma? Well, first we have to really understand, like, what is it, right? Charisma is really your secret weapon because charisma creates a sense of belonging. So when we think about charisma, I'm going to introduce another term that might be familiar to some of you, might not be. It's this idea of social capital. Charisma is about influence. It is about trust. It is about creating for people a sense of belonging. And it's building what we call social capital. If anybody's ever heard of the book Bowling Alone, was research done many years ago, talks a lot about how we build social capital. How do we build that sense of trust? How do we build networks in our community? How do we build a sense of safety and a sense of belonging in our community? How do we engage people and get them to participate? All of these elements are part of what we call social capital. Great storytelling can help us build social capital by creating charisma as an organization. We want to be careful when we think about charisma related to nonprofit organizations, that it's not just about our leader. Is our executive director charismatic? It's not about that. You don't necessarily have to have a really charismatic individual to build a charismatic organization. But when we think about building charisma, the key thing that we really want to focus on is that sense of belonging. We want donors to feel like they belong. They're part of our mission. They're part of our organization. We want trust in our community, and we want to build those networks so that our organization has influence. This is going to be key to our ability to raise money. And when we think about social capital, there's two ways to think about social capital. One is this idea of bonded social capital. When you look at the research around social capital, churches are great at building social capital. Why? Because you have shared beliefs, shared values. It creates a somewhat of a homogenous group in many church communities, creates strong ties and deep trust, and there's a sense of exclusivity, right? That we build this sense of connection in our organization when we have shared values, common interests, and it automatically leads to trust. What we want to do in our organization is, to some extent, we can create that same sense of bonded social capital by telling great stories first internally and creating a storytelling culture. How do we all tell stories about our organization? And then we want to take that social capital that we have in our group, our little tight-knit group of the organization, our staff, our volunteers, our board members, and we want to say, how do we take this out in the community to build partnerships? And this is where bridged social capital comes in. How do we create connection between one homogeneous group and another homogeneous group? Oftentimes, these groups will have very weak ties, and what we need to do is tell great stories and engage in relationship in order to strengthen those ties. Telling great stories, engaging in relationship, helps us build the trust that we need for good social capital. And by bridging from one group to the next, we create a sense of inclusivity rather than exclusivity. So how do we engage others in the work that we do? How do we build this thing called social capital? We know it starts with telling great stories, but what's the connection? So when we think about building charisma for our organization, we want to think about how are we motivated by our mission? And I know that for most nonprofit leaders, this sort of feels like a no-brainer. But the reality is many nonprofit organizations don't spend time on a regular basis really looking at their mission and understanding how they sit within the broader ecosystem of their community. And it's important that your board, your volunteers, your staff, everybody engaged in your organization really understands why we exist. Take time to look at your mission statement to say, what does it actually mean? Is it time to update it? Do we understand why we exist, and how do we then reflect that to the world through a mission statement? And we've got to make sure that we're all on the same page. It amazes me when I walk into boardrooms to do training. One of the questions I love to ask, and I usually will have people write it down on paper so it's like, we're not saying it out loud, which is worrisome to some. I'd love to ask the question, why does your organization exist? And if I'm in a room of 15 people, I get at least 12 different answers. That's a little scary, because if we can't all articulate why we exist and we're not all motivated by that same mission focus, it's very hard to create a charismatic organization. Because what happens is we end up telling different stories all over the place. We don't have shared language. We don't have a common sense of purpose. So that's why it's so important to be grounded in why you exist as an organization. Take time to do that, and take time to talk about it regularly in your organization. You want to cultivate a can-do culture, meaning everybody plays a part. How do people make decisions in your organization? Who gets to make decisions in your organization? Do people feel empowered to bring ideas to the table? That's going to create charisma from within that will spill out as you do your work in the community. Think about how you make data-driven decisions. What are you measuring? We manage what we measure, so pay attention to what you're measuring. Nurture innovation in your organizations. Really think about how you encourage creativity. Be people-focused, both internally and externally. Not what can this person do for me, but actually focused on the person. Make sure that when you're building your organization's communication, that you're using compelling communication. And it's that sense of how do we tell great stories, right? What's this compelling communication that we're sharing that's going to build charisma for our organization? And that usually means super focused, shared language, consistent message. That's what helps build brand and charisma. And we want to be sure that as we're building charisma in our organization, we're really thoughtful and strategic about what does our outreach look like. It's not going to happen just by creating great communication unless we also have a plan to go along with that communication that says, how are we actively going to connect to community? And then provide ways for people to engage in your organization in a really meaningful way. How might people connect to you in a way that creates meaning in their life, right? People give to nonprofit organizations because something in that organization, in the work that the organization is doing, connects to our values, our beliefs, the way that we see the world. That's what creates that connection. That's what motivates individuals to give. So we need to provide that opportunity for people to really be involved and engaged in the work that we're doing in a meaningful way. We also need to make sure that we're setting a great context for our stories. And this has become increasingly important in the world that we're living in today. So it's important to think about what's the context for the story that we're telling. So who's the audience? We all know, if we've done fundraising for any length of time, that good fund development work relies on understanding our audience and being able to segment our audience. So when we think about donor segmentation, if we have a mission that works with young people to prepare them to graduate high school so that they can go on to college, if we're talking to an educator, they might want to hear a very different aspect of the story than if we're talking to a parent. So our audiences, we have to think about who are the different audiences? Who am I talking to with this particular story? And how does my story focus for that audience? We want to make it personal for that audience. So know who you're talking to. Understand the cultural aspect of the audience you're talking to. There's been really interesting research out lately about using asset-based language versus deficit-based language. Some of you might be thinking, what's the difference? I'm not even sure what we mean by that. When we think about asset-based language, it's strengths-based language. Asset-based language connects disparities in a community to wider systemic issues. So think about if you work with homeless populations, do you talk about homeless people as a label, or do you talk about people who are experiencing homelessness? Those are two very different things. They create different images in people's mind. So think about the language that you're using. Is it asset-based? So that you're not talking about, dropout rates in a high school. Maybe instead of saying we try to reduce dropout rates in this high school, create asset-based language that says our program supports students so that they can successfully graduate from high school and move on to their next step, right? So think about the language you use. Are you using asset-based language? Are you using language that's culturally intelligent? And I won't say cultural competency because I kind of don't believe in that term. You could train me for the next 50 years, and I, as a white cisgender woman, would never understand what it's like to navigate life in the United States as a Black person. I wouldn't get it. I would never understand what it's like to navigate as a Black man in this country, no matter how much you train me. I can't be culturally competent. I can, however, create cultural intelligence that says, I notice certain things about other cultures. I understand that my lived experience is different from someone else's. And if I'm going to be speaking to different bodies of people, different audiences, I have to respect the stories of that audience. And I have to speak in a way that is culturally intelligent for that audience. We also need to be mindful when we're telling great stories, when we're building that charisma in our organization, that we're balancing those emotions. As I mentioned earlier, we want to focus on here's a problem, here's a solution that our organization provides, but do it without creating a lot of anxiety or distress for an individual. If we move people to anxiety and distress, it's very difficult for them to take action. They feel paralyzed. So when we're doing fund development work, we ultimately want them to take action. We want them to engage with us more deeply. We want them to give money. And if we paralyze them with an overarching emotion, then it makes it very hard for them to respond. Okay. So just a couple of final tips for you as we kind of go through this, and feel free to type in the chat box any questions that you might have as we're moving through this. But I just want to offer a couple of final tips when you think about telling great stories in your organization. One is be really thoughtful about the elements of your story. So what are the characters? What are the setting? Go back to the tips that I gave in the beginning. When we think about telling a great story, what's the GPS that I'm setting? That's our setting, right? Where are we in the story? Who are the individuals involved in the story? And tell your story from the perspective of the people that are served, the impact that your organization has. That's the character aspect of your story, not the needs of your organization. People don't really care that you need a new building if you're doing a capital campaign. They care what's going to happen in that building. They care how that building and the things going on inside of that building are going to impact the community. So be really careful about who your character is in that story. But you want to be mindful of what are the story elements? What are the characters? What's the setting? What's the quote unquote conflict? What's the road bump that somebody ran into? Why did they need us as an organization to step in if we're a social service agency? If we're a museum or a zoo or another type of organization that brings cultural relevance to our community and builds community just by their existence. Like, how do we intersect? Why are we necessary? That's kind of that conflict and resolution gets to our why. Why are we necessary in our community? The other thing you want to be really mindful of when you're telling stories is think about the channels. We have so many different channels available to us now when it comes to storytelling. We have all kinds of different avenues for social media. We have all types of, we have print, we have video, we have still photographs, we have, online, we have in person. We have so many different opportunities to tell story. Don't feel like you have to do them all, especially if you're working with a smaller nonprofit organization and you think, I can barely manage one social media outlet. I don't know how I'm going to do 7. That's okay. Focus your channels on the audience that you're trying to reach. Focus your channels on what your organization has the capacity to do. And if all you can do is maybe navigate a really great LinkedIn page, then focus on a great LinkedIn page and interaction and engaging people in story on LinkedIn. If all you can do is navigate a great Facebook page, focus on that. But think about who are the audiences I'm trying to reach and what's the best channel to reach them. Don't try to be all things to all people. Figure out who your audience is and who you want to talk to. And get focused on a couple of channels that are right for your audiences. And then the story focus might change a little bit depending on the audience, depending on the channel. How I tell a story on Facebook looks different from how I tell a story in a video, looks different from how I tell a story sitting down face to face with someone, looks different from how I tell a story on TikTok, right? The channel is going to have something to say about how you tell the story and what the focus is. The key is to create consistency in your organization around language. Make sure that when you're talking about, for example, my last executive director position, when I started, we were a social service agency. We were dealing predominantly with people who were living below the poverty line. And we often used language around clients. We talked a lot about clients. We talked a lot about people in need. We talked a lot about poor people when I first started there. And we started to create conversations around what does this language actually mean, as we were trying to learn to shift from deficit language to asset-based language. We spent a good year just having conversations around language, talking about it from a cultural intelligence perspective, talking about what asset-based language does for a person versus deficit-based language, talking about how we talked about the people that we served. We did that so we could create shared language across our organization. We got rid of the term client. We began talking about our neighbors. We shifted the way that we talked about poverty. We got rid of certain language in our organization, and it took time. And we had to do it through a lot of conversation together so that we could create that shared language so that when our volunteers, our board members, our staff, it didn't matter who was in the community talking about this, they were using similar language. That helps create brand consistency. That helps build charisma because we're creating a sense of belonging with our language. So be mindful of that consistency in creating shared storytelling. And then the last thing, when we're telling stories, a lot of times in the nonprofit sector, we tell stories in writing. We send appeal letters. We're writing information on our social media channels. We're writing things on our website. A lot of the work that we do in fund development is the written word. Be thoughtful about writing well. Make sure that you're using conversational writing. I mentioned that earlier. How do we talk to a friend? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Make sure that you're using active language in your writing. And make sure that you know how to write well. Writing is a big part of fund development work and a necessity for how we communicate our message to the world. So I am going to ask you now what your lingering questions are or what tip you might have. As you think about your organization, the things that you've seen work really well, all of you bring experience to the table. So is there a great tip that you want to share with our audience, or do you have a lingering question that you're not 100% certain about some of the things we talked about? So.
That was so wonderful, Tamela. Thank you so much. We'll give it a minute to let people have their questions pop up in the chat and share some of their insights as well. I especially loved, this really resonated with me. People don't want to know that you're building a building, right? They want to know what's happening inside, the impact that that building is going to have. Relaying that impact is so important. And I also love how you talk about cultural intelligence and shared language and charisma and having that brand consistency and making sure that everybody's on the same wavelength and using language that's consistent with your mission, with your community, the people that you serve, is so very important. So thank you so much for those insights. I think that this is a unique perspective on storytelling that we don't get very often. Some things that aren't often thought about, but need to be thought about. So I see some questions coming in here, and I'm going to go ahead and start marking those. While we're waiting for more to come in, I do want to announce that Donorbox has a series of 4 high-impact webinars called the Donorbox Power Up Nonprofit Fundraising Boot Camp. And if you are in charge of fundraising, campaigning, events, or donations, this nonprofit fundraising boot camp is for you. This is to prepare you for Giving Tuesday and the year end. This is coming up very quickly, you guys. So with this, you'll learn actionable steps for your nonprofit's fundraising initiatives, from donation page optimization to tracking progress. We've already started level 2, communication and engagement tools to strengthen donor trust, will take place next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you've missed level 1, do not fret. We have the recording and assignments posted in our Donorbox Knowledge community, and you will see the link, receive the link for those once you register. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that link so that you can learn more about the series and sign up. So here it is. I am sharing it now. Okay. On to the good stuff. This is what we've been waiting for, the Q&A. I know we have some really great ones coming in. So Tamela, are you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's go.
Excellent. Okay, so we had a lot of requests to repeat the books of the names of the books that you mentioned. So if you've got those living in your brain, could you mention those again? And then I can also include those within our Donorbox Knowledge community, the titles and authors for those of you who have, if you missed it.
Yeah, so the first one I talked about, it's a very short little book, and it's called Do Story: How to Tell Your Story So the World Listens. And it's written by Babette Buster.
That's a great name.
I know, it is great. I saw her speak many years ago, and I was like, oh, I have to go buy her book. She was great.
Awesome.
What I love about it is it's an easy read. It's very short. It's not academic. I mean, I work in academia, so, but I also know academia can be stuffy and hard to catch sometimes. So it's not real academic. So encourage you to read that one. The other one, which I think somebody did pop in the chat box, Emotion Raising. And it's terrible that I can't think of the author's name offhand, but I thought I saw it pop into the chat box.
Yes, and I can do some investigating.
Yeah.
There we go.
So Emotion Raising is a really interesting book when you begin to unpack and think about how do people respond to anger? How do they respond to distress? How do they respond to, fear? When it comes to the language that we use in fundraising, especially our appeal letters, like we all know we need a balance of data and emotion, but what does that balance really look like? So it's a really fascinating book about the science behind how our brain responds to those different emotions.
Excellent.
Very good.
Awesome. So next one, and thank you for that, everybody. Please dig into those books, and I will also include the titles and authors for those within our Donorbox knowledge community for you to refer back to. I love this question. For a startup organization, what are some tips that you have to develop content for a story when things are kind of in the pre-story activities phase? I think this is a challenge for a lot of new and small nonprofits.
Oftentimes for new nonprofits, what we find is stories tend to center around the founders. And people start a nonprofit organization because they've noticed a need, they've had a personal experience where maybe they were trying to find a way to get help with a particular issue in their family and they couldn't. And they said, well, there's a gap in the community. How do we begin to fill that gap? And so oftentimes when we see young startup nonprofit organizations or small organizations that are pretty close to the founder, the story tends to be around that founder's need, which is great. And we also have to be mindful of how do we connect that individual founder's need with the broader systemic issues. And this is where data comes in, right? Maybe I've had an experience where, say, for example, that I had a family member who was dealing with cancer. And we think cancer, there's 900 different nonprofits in any community that are working with cancer patients. But what about the need for food? For example, cancer patients, sometimes there's a lot of dietary changes. Sometimes there's challenge in dietary needs because of medication and treatment coming with cancer. I know of a woman here in my community in West Michigan who, while she was going through her own cancer treatment, really struggled with preparing meals and having the right food and having good quality, clean food. And as a result, when she went into remission and was done with all of her cancer treatment, she started a small nonprofit organization around this idea of feeding people who are going through cancer treatment. And they actually use students who learn to become chefs in the process of their organization. So they're sort of doing that side of thing. And then they're also feeding, and they have home delivery for specialized meals that are designed based on your cancer treatment and what your individual dietary needs are. And so it was a need that she sensed in her own life. And as she began to start telling the story of the organization, she talked about her personal experience, but she always connected it to the broader community. And she could say statistically, like, here's what we know. So it's always making that connection, because the hazard in only focusing on the founder or that one key story is what happens as the organization grows. The organization, we don't want it to be built around that one individual. We always want to connect what we're doing to the larger systems. And so that's where it's, even if I might be a founder of a small nonprofit just starting up or a small NGO just starting up, I still want to connect my experience to the broader community. And I do that by understanding what's happening in the broader community. What are those key data points? Does that make sense?
That was a beautiful answer. You can tell that you are a storyteller. That really painted a great picture. And doing that, you also answered Russell's question. He had asked, he has a very personal connection to his cause. So how do you suggest sharing that personal connection when there's really no limit, keeping in mind that you want to have people feel connected to your connection, but not put people off? So
Sure.
I think that,
and you know, that's going to depend on the individual. Sorry, that's going to depend on the individual and the audience you're telling the story to, right? Our story always adjusts depending on the audience. Vulnerability is so important in building connection, in creating that charisma for your organization. Vulnerability in storytelling. And yet, we also know professionally, especially if we're a staff person, how vulnerable do we want to be? I shared a story many years ago with my board who was wrestling with when I was an executive director, with what it meant to deal with people living in poverty. And I shared a very personal story from my life about when I went through a period of having to deal with poverty in my own life. And the first time I shared that story with my board, talk about feeling vulnerable. Like I felt horribly vulnerable in telling that story because it was fresh. But then I also realized what a gift it was for my board to understand a different perspective. And so that's where I've learned, like, where can our personal stories connect to our mission and help people understand perspective? And can I tell them in a way where I feel safe, where I feel emotionally okay? And so that's the important piece. When you have a real personal story, you have to ask yourself, you have to know that you're prepared to tell a story where you feel safe, that you're emotionally healed from whatever that trauma may have been, so that you can tell the story in a way that doesn't create more damage. And then your audience is going to determine how much of that story you tell. And that comes with practice and paying attention, right? So, yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think that's an aspect that people don't often think about either, is, they want to make sure they're not crossing a line with their storytelling, but you also have to protect your heart and know what feels safe, and, so that you can continue to serve and feel good about the story that you're sharing. And thank you so much for sharing, Tamela. I think that gives a wonderful outlook.
And if I can just share one more thing in regards to that, I think it's important in nonprofit organizations, as we think about telling our story, it often means we're telling someone else's story. We're telling the story of someone who's used our services. We're telling the story of someone who's been impacted by our organization. And how do we do that in a way that is thoughtful and intentional and honors the individual whose story we're using? There's an old quote that one of these days I need to figure out where this quote came from. I've never been able to find it, but there's an old quote that talks about the greatest, I think it might have been Maya Angelou who said this, the greatest gift we can give someone is to listen to their story. And when we think about that from the perspective of all the people that we serve in our nonprofit organization, and I hear this all the time from clients, well, we work with a vulnerable population. Well, we work with children. Well, we work with this. Well, we work with sexual abuse survivors. And we think we can't tell those stories, when in reality, the greatest gift we can give an individual is their story, to amplify their voice in our community and say, this matters and this is important. But we have to do it in a way that honors the individual involved. And that means thoughtfully sitting down and having a conversation when you want to share a story, making sure that person is emotionally healthy and far enough removed from whatever that trauma was or whatever that situation was that brought them into your organization, so that the story is not creating more damage for them. And then walking alongside as you learn to tell that story, because that's how we honor. That's that cultural intelligence piece. That's that honoring another person's vulnerability. And it is so incredibly important that we're mindful of that as we're connecting with people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight. That really resonates with me. I used to work for a women's shelter, and thinking about storytelling in a way that honors the mission, honors the community that we're serving, honors the story that we're telling. It takes time and patience, and it has many different lives and iterations. So thank you for that. Okay, we have a couple of questions around change of language and shared language. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Maybe give some examples of, I know that's pretty broad, but best you can talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. So shared language comes with having conversation. For example, one of the best exercises that you can do to help your board and your volunteers and your staff understand your mission is take time, spend an hour unpacking your mission statement and say, what does it mean to say that we serve homeless people, right? What does that mean? And then that sort of gets to this question of how do we create asset-based language? When we talk about homeless people, everybody has this mental image that pops into their head. It might be different for all of us, but we all have a mental image that pops into our head. It's usually not a great image. And it's usually very despairing of an individual who's experiencing homelessness. So when we say we work with homeless people, we are automatically creating a deficit. And we're automatically categorizing and othering an entire population. When we talk about we help people experiencing homelessness, it's not that the individual is homeless, right? It's not all of those mental pictures that come into our head. We have someone who is going through an experience that doesn't define who they are, that doesn't define, how valued they are as a human being. They are simply going through an experience, and our organization steps into that experience to help whatever it is we're doing, right? And so this is where asset-based language and shared language becomes so important, is if we have those conversations in a group and we start to talk about why do we use certain language, what are the images that pop into our head, what are the images we think it creates for other people, and then we begin to say, what if we said this differently? When we say a homeless person, are we attaching value to the fact that they're homeless? Or if we say someone experiencing homelessness, they as an individual still have all the dignity, right? We haven't diminished who they are. We've simply said, here's something that you're experiencing. And it's the same, whether it's someone who is a victim of domestic violence, are they a battered woman, or are they a woman who has experienced an assault? Those are two very different things. When we talk about working with youth, and we talk about the example that I gave earlier, we're dealing with dropout rates at a school. That's a negative connotation. What if we said we're helping people to achieve graduation in a timely manner that sets them up for future success? That's a positive, like we're actually moving towards something. So it's shifting that language, shifts all those mental images, shifts all of the way that we think about cultural intelligence and how are we honoring populations. There's so many different pieces to that. And so it's, if we can create those conversations in our organization, then we begin to come to some shared understanding together. We create understanding together to say, what's the language that we want to use that's going to honor who we work with?
Yes. Thank you so much for that. I think that really clarified everything. Now, take it away. You've got some upcoming programs before we log out, and all stay tuned. We're going to drop some helpful links after Tamela does her thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, just want to encourage you to pop onto the Johnson Center website. We are based in West Michigan. We work with organizations all over the country and around the globe. And our goal is to help strengthen nonprofit organizations and foundations. So we just have a few upcoming workshops. Feel free to check those out on our website. Thinking about change, how do we create change and navigate change in our organization? Partnerships, mergers might be a big challenge that many nonprofits are wrestling with right now. And then I'm also teaching a grant writing course, a basic grant writing course in October. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free to jump on our website at johnsoncenter.org and you can find all the information there. Really appreciate this opportunity to be here today with Donorbox and appreciate all of the great resources that you provide to the sector, and not to mention the great technology that you provide to help us do our jobs.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tamela. These look like some amazing programs. Please visit this website and see how they can help you. If we did not get to your question today, do not fret. We've launched the link to the Donorbox Knowledge Community. You can drop any of the questions that you have about storytelling or changing that mindset of your organization, your board, your volunteers, your staff to be all on the same plane. Please drop your questions in the Donorbox Knowledge Community and we will do our best to answer them for you. Tamela, thank you again for sharing your expertise and your unique and beautiful perspective on storytelling. It was such an insightful session for me. I'm sure that you enjoyed just as much as I did. And I want to take a moment to thank all of you for all that you do in your community, for the people that you serve, for the work that you do, for your big hearts. We are so proud to provide the tools and resources you need to help you help others. So have a great one, everyone.